are listening to the Moody Girl podcast with me, Emily Fazer. I'll be opening the minds of experts, enthusiasts, and storytellers, discovering their secrets on health and how to make the most out of life.
So welcome back, everyone. I'm so happy to introduce my next guest, which is Pippa Cossens, a registered osteopath and SIRPA trained chronic pain recovery coach. Welcome, Pippa. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, well, it's been my absolute pleasure. Chronic pain hasn't really been something I've delved quite deeply into yet. So it hasn't been something that I personally have dealt with, like whether it's a severe back injury or something where you physically can't move. And it was only when I was kind of researching a little bit into it where one of my friends kind of introduced me to SIRPA and the work that, you're all doing, which is incredible. But I started to think about how catastrophic it must be for everyone out there who is suffering with chronic pain on a daily basis, and they've got nowhere to turn. They've tried, extensive massage therapy and going to the doctors and x-rays and all of those things, and it did make me think about how isolating that must feel. So this episode is for all of those people out there. Pippa is the lady to speak to, as you've experienced it yourself.
I have.
So tell us a little bit more about your story with chronic pain and how you are here today telling your story.
Oh, thank you. As I say, thank you very much for having me here. And I myself, so I'm an osteopath, and I've been an osteopath for 30 years. And, I considered that I knew quite a lot about the body at that point. And then probably in about 2013, 2014, I started having, interesting enough, it started with fatigue, with chronic fatigue. And then the pain came a little later in the year, and it was just persistent, and it wouldn't go away, and it was mostly in my low back, and I'd had a previous back injury, so I thought it was a flare up of that. I'd had a disc, and I thought it was that, and as I say, but it was accompanied by this tiredness and not really feeling great, not feeling ill, but not feeling great. And so that bimbled on. And eventually I think I went to see the doctor, and they did some blood tests, and there was nothing conclusive on the blood test. I had my thyroid tested for the fatigue. And then it wibbled on for another, I don't know how many months, another year maybe even. I then went back and they tested my vitamin D, and I had low vitamin D, and that was like, well, that doesn't really explain the pain. But so like you say, we did that, and then the vitamin D levels came up and the pain was still there. And then probably the following year I went back and I saw the GP again, and actually at that point they said, well, we'll give you an MRI scan. And they scanned me with the MRI, and it showed I must have been in my I don't know, late 30s, early 40s at that point. And it said, you've got degenerative disc disease all the way down your spine from your neck to your pelvis. And it's like, in a way, you would take that and you go, okay, and you can't run, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that, you've got to be careful. And so you go into that fear sort of bubble. And then but it didn't explain the tiredness, and it didn't explain the aches that I got in my limbs, and it didn't explain the jaw ache, and it didn't explain the sore feet and the irritable bowel and the anxiety that had seemed to have come with all of this. And so eventually that same GP actually referred me to the rheumatologist, and then they came up with a diagnosis in 2017 of fibromyalgia. And it feels like a sentence, if that makes sense. You feel like you've been handed this, although somebody's now said, oh, we know what it is, you still feel like you're stuck with something. And I think it is very, I don't know quite what the word is, but like you say, there's a lack of hope at that point that, life's ever going to change. Anyway, luckily in the same year, 2017, I discovered SIRPA, and SIRPA is the Stress Illness Recovery Practitioners Association. And it's an organization in the UK that trains healthcare practitioners in a completely different mind-body approach to chronic pain recovery. And I went to their conference in 2017, and literally it was life-changing. So I have experienced that myself. And I also know that as a practitioner, I didn't know this. And then actually I then trained myself as a SIRPA practitioner, and we now help a huge number of people who are in a similar position. You don't have to have a diagnosis of fibromyalgia. It might be called chronic pain. Some people might have what they call functional neurological disorder, chronic regional pain syndrome. There's so many names for this sort of untestable thing, this untestable pain, you know, fatigue.
So fibro, just for the because I mean I didn't know before I kind of read more about your story, and for the audience, can you define what fibromyalgia actually is?
Yeah, I think it's a sort of an umbrella of symptoms, if that makes sense. And it is a little bit of a term for actually we've ruled everything else out and this is what we've got left. And so essentially it's characterized by chronic pain, so persistent pain that has been there for more than 3 months. It's accompanied by chronic fatigue, brain fog, so a sort of a cognitive disruption, often insomnia, irritable bowel syndrome. But it's also when you start looking and asking people, suddenly you're like, oh yes, and I've got a skin rash, and actually I've got jaw pain, and I get persistent headaches. And suddenly you can start to see that there's a whole collection of symptoms. But fibromyalgia itself tends to be characterized by this persistent pain, as I say, chronic fatigue, brain fog, anxiety, and as I say, sometimes irritable bowel. So
okay, interesting. And then sorry, carry on with the conference story. So when you kind of first discovered SIRPA and this whole new world opened up for you.
It was one of those things. There's a really funny thing in the sort of what we would term the sort of mind-body approach to pain recovery. In that world, there are some people who kind of read the book and get better the next day. Now that is more rare than common, if that makes sense. But it is. I had one of those moments. As I say, the SIRPA conference in 2017 was called Chronic Pain: The Role of Emotions. And I'd gone to the conference with both my own patient hat on and with my work hat on, because I was like interested about this for my patients. And it was amazing. It was the lecturers were medics, doctors, physios, all from all across the world, particularly the States and here. And they were talking about this thing that I had, and they understood it, and they knew what it was, and they could explain it from a neurobiological perspective. And more than that, they knew how to fix it. And they'd got the evidence for that. And I was exhausted at the end of that day, but I had a pain-free day the next day. I mean, wow. I literally didn't have any pain for the next day. To be fair, it then came back. But that's one of the characteristics really of things like fibromyalgia and these chronic pain syndromes, is that the pain varies. Now, some people have very, very, very persistent pain and it is there all the time. But quite often it will move site. So sometimes I say it's on my right side in my lower back, and then it might move to the left side. And it might vary in intensity. And so actually some days it's absolutely excruciating. You think, but I don't know what I've done. But it's hellish. And then another day it might be slightly less, but there's no rhyme or reason apparently to that. You're not like, oh, I didn't do anything today, therefore I've got no pain. It's like sometimes on the quiet days, your pain is worse. Mm-hmm. So after the conference, I thought, okay, I read some of the books. I thought maybe with my head on, my practitioner head on, I can sort this myself. And I couldn't quite. I needed a SIRPA practitioner myself. So I went to see somebody, and he just started to point out the bits of the story, if that makes sense, that made sense. He could look in with a slightly more objective view and go, hang on a minute, let's have a look at what we describe in practice as what's in your backpack. What are you carrying in your health story? Not so what obviously happened at onset, but also what perhaps was happening in the preceding 6 months, what's happened in your both physical and emotional history all the way back to childhood, really. And one of the people who spoke actually at the conference was a lady called Donna Jackson Nawazaka, and she wrote a book called Childhood Disrupted, and that is all about what we call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So people who have ACEs, so have had disruptions in their childhood, perhaps they had parents that didn't get on and a parent that left, and then the remaining parent may have been depressed and not kind of emotionally available, which is not uncommon for a huge number of us. If you've had 3 adverse childhood experiences or more, you are more likely to end up with chronic pain as an adult, 30% more likely to. And also, I know you have an interest in sort of autoimmune things. It's a similar situation. It's so it's the same there's the same part of the building blocks to, you know, whether that trips somebody into developing an autoimmune condition as well as pain. So
Wow. I mean, that's so interesting. There's so many different parts of that that are interesting. And I think, you know, when you, I guess, if we relate it to your story, because I've watched
yeah.
like a few TED Talks on it and I found it absolutely fascinating. But yeah, if we relate it to your story and
Mhm.
okay, when you went and found that SIRPA trainer and you were like, okay, I'm gonna make this decision now, I'm gonna actually invest in it and I believe in it. What was the process? You know, how did that look like for you? Was it a long process? You know, like, was it, you're shaking your head already.
No, no,
I'm quite shocked. Yeah,
yeah,
talk me
no,
through it.
so essentially I would say, I mean, I had 6 sessions. I saw him for 6 sessions that were an hour long.
Mm,
And part of that process is of filling in, which we do with our patients too, is a very large, long questionnaire. And it basically makes you look at, again, all those parts of your story. So again, what was going on when your pain came on? You know, what had happened before that? Have you had pain before? Had you had other sort of psychophysiologic disorders before? Had you had sort of something like an irritable bowel before? Have you had, you know, so there are all sorts of questions in this questionnaire. You know, was there something going on in your childhood when this happened? So there's that part of it. And then really with that, he then helped me to start unpicking that and look at, you know, the points at which in my life, my nervous system had got overwhelmed. And suddenly it's like the penny drops and you're like, oh, hang on a minute. Actually, you know, I hadn't had anything massively terrible maybe happen to me in my life, but actually a history of significant enough events, perhaps on top of the fact that I consider myself to be a highly sensitive person. You know, I have a more sensitivity than perhaps others, and about 10% of the population are like that. And so it was really helpful. And I think there was a big point in the journey of recovery about being worth enough to get better. That was really huge for me, and actually giving myself the time and the credit and the nurture. Some of it was about things to calm my nervous system. So we may not be aware that our nervous system is overwhelmed, but it might be that actually you know, meditation, mindfulness, being in nature, all those things from a point of view is actually, what does my nervous system right now? Being in the present moment, you know, actually we need to be now rather than worrying about the past or worrying, you know, forward and catastrophizing about the future, all those things. So really with him, I did 6 sessions probably over a period of maybe 3 months. And actually then I felt like I got the toolkit. I'd got the tools and the techniques for me to take on. And then that doesn't mean that I wouldn't say I'm 100% pain-free now. Sometimes I'll have a pain flare or I'll have a bad day. And then, but now I know to stop and go, okay, no, I haven't done any damage. I didn't lift anything heavy. I didn't turn over in bed in a funny way. What happened? And I had a
mm.
perfect example of this the other day. My son currently who's 21, is traveling in Japan. And he called me at 8 in the evening, which is odd because it was 4 o'clock in the morning there, and they'd been woken up by a earthquake alarm, and it was a bit, you know, and they'd all a bit wired, and he was fine, and there'd been an earthquake, and he was fine. And I'd been like, okay, that's fine, you know, I'm okay. I little think about, oh, maybe there'll be another one, and I did a little bit of that mummy thing, and then I went to bed. No pain, no trouble that day at all. I woke up in the middle of the night in excruciating pain. It felt like somebody'd removed a rib, turned it round and stuck it back on again. And I would just like lay there and went, okay, that's my subconscious at night dealing with the fact that, oh my goodness, he's been in an earthquake. Is he okay? He's the other side of the world. I did take some painkillers because I needed to go back to sleep. And then it was still there a bit in the morning, but by 10 o'clock the next morning it had gone. Now, because I have the knowledge that it's not something to worry about and that pain can be completely created by the brain, that doesn't mean you're imagining it, but the brain creates pain. It meant that I wasn't worried about it. It's like, okay, I had a stressful thing happen yesterday. It's okay. And I did all those things to calm my system down.
Wow. Wow. I mean, that is insane if you think about that. That actually, and my friend, she's a physiotherapist, and she was kind of, as she was training, she was saying to me, like, pain is actually, you know, something that the brain creates as well. And I was like, how is that possible? Like, I just, at the time, I couldn't, it was so baffling. I couldn't get my mind around it. I was just like,
Yeah.
surely not. Like, okay, whatever. But like, the more I'm reading about it and the more kind of talking to you now, I mean, that's quite an interesting concept as well. The fact that you had that, and in your conscious mind, you were like, that's okay, it's all good, no worries. But your subconscious mind woke you up, as in, like, you are really worried about this actually, and there's part of you that the mum has, you just said, which is going to confront you. And I feel like that as well. So any sort of health ailments that I've had in my life, whether it's I've been on my own journey with premenstrual conditions, with autoimmune conditions, and I feel like they flare up in a time which is your body is basically saying, hello, you're not listening to me,
Yeah.
you're suppressing some stuff here, let it out, otherwise I'm going to show up and I'm going to get more aggravated. And it seems as though there's quite correlation between all of these, and with pain as well.
Completely. And I think of them as a spectrum, interestingly enough. I think, often there's a wonderful thing about pain, or the meme thing that comes up that says, if you don't listen to me when I whisper, you'll have to listen to me when I shout. And I think in our modern lifestyle, I think we are living in a thing where we are at a heightened, particularly obviously in the last few years, but I think we're living in a heightened level now. And I think that's why there's so much chronic pain and so many autoimmune conditions, because whereas we might have bumbled along and we've sat under that tipping point, we sat under the radar and we were okay, I think things like social media haven't helped. I think we're constantly being, our nervous systems are constantly being agitated. And interesting enough, actually, there's research to show that when we are in that slight fight or flight state the whole time, we actually end up having a slightly inflammatory response as well. So it controls the inflammation. And the reason for that is, if back in the day, if you were worried about running away from the tiger, or being eaten by the tiger, or injured by the tiger, your body is preparing itself. So it's increasing the muscle tension, it's alerting your nervous system, but it's also preparing the chemicals within your body if you do get injured. So you need an inflammatory response to heal, and so it produces an inflammatory response. And so we've got a huge number of the population with kind of low-grade inflammation going on alongside pain, but also alongside the situation that occurs in chronic pain, but also in so many of these other conditions. How many people with something have got anxiety, a bit of irritable bowel, might not be able to quite control their temperature properly, can't sleep, have skin rashes, little bit of food intolerance that isn't actually an allergy. We've got this whole pot of what we kind of call autonomic dysregulation. So your autonomics is that automatic part of your nervous system that's controlling all those features. And some people's, it just disturbs them, and you then end up with perhaps your main thing is pain, but actually you sit and think, oh, today I was fine. Yesterday I ate a sandwich and I was fine, and today it's like maybe I'm gluten intolerant. Or sometimes you sleep and sometimes you don't sleep, and that crushing fatigue of like, I've got nothing in the tank. And to me, that a lot of that comes back to this nervous system overwhelm, and those symptoms are all absolutely real, and the pain is absolutely real, but it doesn't necessarily relate to tissue damage. That's the most important thing. So you may have done it, perhaps you did it when you broke an arm, but after 3 months, essentially, when an arm heals, the bones have healed, you shouldn't have any pain anymore. You might have a bit of weakness and stiffness for a while until you get going, but then after sort of 3 to 6 months, it should be fine. But we have people who come in who've got injuries and they said, oh, well, I fell and twisted my knee 30 years ago. It's like there's the mechanism for that then changes. So in that moment, you'll have inflammation, tissue healing, swelling, bruising, all of that stuff within a critical injury. But actually, that's all gone away within 3 months. And it's then a glitch in the nervous system. The nervous system is starting to perceive danger in almost any scenario. So people say, oh, when it's a cold day, my pain's really bad. It's like your body's sensing cold and seeing it as danger. It might be that people, certain people trigger you. You're like, you're fine. Oh, I'm fine until I go to my mother-in-law's house. Actually, then I have a really painful day. And the opposite side of that too is often people who are in pain find it so hard to go out and do. It's so difficult to go out and socialize. You're in pain, you're tired, you don't want to do that, you don't have the energy. And actually then they go, oh, but I did go out on Sunday, and I had a really good day. And it's because actually your nervous system's distracted. And a little bit back to what you were saying before about that subconscious kicking in, the subconscious is running at something like 70 million bits a second. I mean, it runs really fast, where the conscious is much slower. And it also processes a lot at night. So when we're asleep, that's why it'll wake us with pain often in the second part of the night. But it is that sometimes we've got to bring these things into the consciousness. And that's a lot of what I do. It's like noticing, oh, hang on a minute. You said that it always happens with this, or it always happens with that. And I think those are the things where we can start to go, oh, okay, hang on a minute, that's not dangerous. You know, and that's noticing those things is one of the key tools in recovery. Is like, what is triggering my nervous system? What can I do about that?
Do you think, because I've been kind of exploring this idea of unlearning at the moment. So, you know, we go through life as a child and we're born as this pure being, you know, no kind of qualms, no stresses, no worries. We're okay. We're whole, we're perfect.
Yeah.
And then we go through life, and as you say, and this is what I imagine, the backpack comes on.
Yeah.
And, you know, we have to conform in terms of, you know, you don't do that. You have to, you know, you can't put your pants on your head, or do you know what I mean? That's not socially acceptable. You've got to sit down in that teacher's classroom, and you can't talk while the teacher is talking, and you need to put your hand up before you go to the toilet. And then, you know, all of these different things that society loads into our backpack of shame and things that we can and can't do, strips away from the purity of who we once were. And that's a kind of process that I'm working through at the moment. And I was doing a bit of subconscious work this morning before kind of jumping on this. And so powerful when you actually give yourself the time, the space to explore those areas, to do visualizations, to look at areas in your life that may have been why you've got this glitch in the nervous system later down the line, and why these traumas are stuck in there. So I mean, that's also leads me to my next question. What is your kind of belief on, you know, trauma, stress, and how, you know, do you think people are suppressing these things? Do you think people are now becoming more understanding about how to release these things? What's the best way of releasing any type of trauma or stress?
I think that all of the above. I think it's so true. There's quite a lot of research to show that actually, again, that, like you say, that very situation, perhaps when you were young and in school and you couldn't express yourself and you needed to move a bit and you were very quashed and you tried to be a good girl, you know, and you didn't want to be exuberant because that was, you know, not socially acceptable. All of that is incredibly important, because what then happens is that leads on often to changes in personality type, in the sense that people then can become a people pleaser. For instance, they may become a little bit OCD, their perfectionism comes in, all those things. And essentially, what are we doing in that state? We're putting ourselves on high alert. We're going into meerkat mode. And essentially, if we're running childhood like that, then by the time we hit adult, we're exhausted. But it's incredibly important. And actually, we don't have time today to get on my soapbox about changing the education system to change the health service. But that's a whole thing for another day. But no, you're so right. And I think what's really interesting, when you're in this world, you suddenly have a huge awareness of how important trauma and stress is. And yet, sort of almost just outside the bubble, people are not aware of that, and they're pushing themselves, and we're pushing our kids too hard. And I mean, the pandemic was a completely, thing with that. I mean, it was an enormously traumatic event globally. And actually, when we have community and group trauma, that's really difficult, because there's nobody being the grounding people, if that makes sense. There's nobody being you're having a traumatic experience, I'm okay. It was like everybody was kind of in it. And then obviously we were being given messages of for the reasons that was to try and keep the population safe, but we were being given messages of fear. We'd like, oh, don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other, don't do that. And then suddenly, of course, then you get these different messages. So all of that, definitely. And I mean, I wrote an article back in 2020, interesting enough, saying that I felt that there would be a chronic pain sort of epidemic off the back of the pandemic. And funny enough, in one of the osteopathic forums the other day, people were saying, are you getting people in with much more persistent pain and pain in different sites? It's like, yeah, we are. So I think that's definitely. And and the trauma work, interesting enough, that's another area. I'm just finishing a a qualification called embodied processing, which is about processing trauma from the body up rather than from it involves some sort of spoken therapy, but it's more about that feeling and learning to feel our feelings and learning to actually complete the cycle of stress, because what often happens is we get stuck in that moment. And I think that it's so important. And funnily enough, in my own story, I'm an adopted child. Now, I was adopted into a beautiful family. I've been very well cared for. I've been very well looked after. However, my nervous system arrived in this world in a stressed environment, didn't quite know where it was at for the first sort of however many months, ended up with different sets of carers and that. Nobody did anything wrong. However, you're then left with that, on alert, I must be a good girl, otherwise, I might get, sort of rejected again. And that's huge. And I consider that, and there's research to back that up, that's important in my story. And I mean, it doesn't have to go that far back. It could be, as I say, you have something, particularly in childhood, it's important though, because if you have something that's not regulated by the adults around you, then actually that's a precursor for chronic pain, as are things like people pleasing, perfectionism, those sorts of personality, striving. The people with those sort of personality types are more likely to experience chronic pain than those without.
And that's so interesting. I was speaking to another guest on one of my shows, and I think I just flippantly said, I haven't had many traumas in my life. It's been, fine, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, okay, let's just park it there. And and that has made me completely spun, my perception of trauma on its head, because, and he was explaining as well that you can have somebody, and he was giving a stat about this child who had seen his whole family, brutally injured and fatally injured in Chicago. And then there was a girl living down in a nice side of Chicago, and she had so much external pressure from her family to perform all the time. And actually, when scientists did the study, there was actually the same amount of trauma for both of those children. But, on the surface, people may be like, oh, you can't, that's not a trauma. You can't call that a trauma. What are you moaning about? Stop being so woke, And I think that's also something to get across to the audience as well, that everyone experiences them differently. And like you, I'm so sensitive. I feel things so strongly. And so I can have a crash, a real crash. If I've been in an energy which isn't feeling I'm consuming that energy, which can be quite negative or quite toxic, I'll take that home with me and almost need to get it out some way, whether that's having a nap, whether that's doing some meditation, whether it's just going for a walk in nature. And I think that's also, we are so individual as human beings, and we can't say, I can't look at your story or, my partner's story or my sister's story and say we're going to be the same. And I think that's where this whole one size fits all approach is so outdated. And going to the GP, and, there's so many things that GP has been amazing for, but time and time again being prescribed the same things for so many different people that's where I was, getting interested in the work that you're doing, because you're looking at the whole person, looking at the backstory of the pain rather than just masking it with some painkillers.
You're so right. And I think also the thing about trauma, and I'm sure you're aware of Dr. Gabor Mate, but he the trauma, I mean, that's not his definition, but the definition with regards to trauma is actually, it's not about the incident that happened. It's not about the parameters of that, however big or small that is. It's about the overwhelm that it causes within somebody's nervous system. So there can be people who can have enormously tragic things happen to them, and actually their resilience within their nervous system is able to cope with that. And then there can be other people, and it can be, seemingly incredibly minor, and it really stays with them, and it really, really overstimulates and puts their nervous system into overwhelm. And then, so the importance of that is part of the process with what we do is to recognize that, see, as I say, what has gone into the backpack, see what we can take out, because there are some things that, perhaps if you are, caring for an elderly relative, and actually your partner's lost their job, and, you've got current stressors that you can't kind of automatically go, oh, I'm just going to ignore those and change them. That's not what we're saying. We're saying, okay, in that situation, we've got to look at how we manage your nervous system in relation to those. So there's lots of techniques that we can do with that. And then there's the bits and bobs of like, actually, I'm not going to worry about, you know, baking for the WI on Friday, or I'm not going to worry about, saying yes, I'll walk your dog every Friday, if that's not something that's within your capacity at that time. And I think that's really important. And as I say, with the chronic pain, one of the things that's really important to do is, for whatever reason people's nervous systems get into these states, there is certainly for pain, the pain reprocessing therapy, which we can then start to retrain the nervous system out of that state. And the Boulder back pain study in 21-22 showed that actually on functional MRI scans of the brain, before people had the pain reprocessing therapy to afterwards, actually their brains changed. So that the brain is neuroplastic. The brain can learn to be in a different way. We can retrain it. It will build new neural pathways until the day that we die. So it's never too late. Sometimes people's pain gets very entrenched. There's a lot about belief, as we mentioned a little bit earlier. You know, if you don't believe, not because it's a religion, but if you don't believe that this is the science of this, and you don't believe that that's the situation for you, it is harder for that to make a change. There is a lot of evidence, but we always have to meet people exactly where they're at. And the beauty of for us is having time with people. You know, we'll spend an hour with a patient the first time we see them, whereas, you know, the GP's got 7.5 minutes if you're lucky. And I think that's enormous. And quite often we'll go through them, we'll take all this history and we'll ask all these questions, and we'll be about 40 minutes in, and somebody will go, no, although they've been saying, I haven't really had any trauma. And then you go, I was a wonderful, wonderful lady, actually, and she had hip pain, and it had come on quite suddenly, and it was quite excruciating, and she was really lame with it, and she was in her 70s, I think, and she came and she said, oh, you know, no, and I said, and it just felt like it had just completely stopped moving. That was sort of how it felt to the tissues. And when I said to her, you know, anything traumatic happened? No. Are you sure? Because it came on very suddenly, and she'd been to the doctor, and she'd been told she got osteoarthritis and that she needed a new hip, and which was, you know, that fine. Then in certain cases, that's definitely the truth, but you don't have to have pain with arthritis. So anyway, she'd done this, and we were going on, and I treating. I said, it feels very stuck, like you're holding it. You sure there's no, nothing at all. and then about 40 minutes in, she went, actually, my daughter was in hospital for 6 months last year. She nearly died. I'm like, okay, that'll be it. But it was when her daughter had come, I think it was her daughter. It was when her daughter had come out of hospital that her hip had started hurting. All the time her daughter was in hospital, she was managing, she was doing those things. And then she got to the point where her daughter, had come out of hospital, and it's almost like she could relax a little bit. She was a bit off duty, and the nervous system went, whoa, you know. And she had, I mean, in the end, actually, she did need to have a new hip, but actually that she walked out of the practice completely differently to how she'd walked in. Wow. And it's bonkers, and it's like magic. It's repeatable magic, so it's amazing. And it's sometimes just that penny dropping, you know.
Absolutely. And I think that's also, if I think about my own, or I guess the audience who might relate to that, in terms of, like, you know, when you're working really, really hard at work, and you're going hard, and you're just like, yes, I just need to make it through to the holiday. I've got the holiday, countdown is on, 30 days. One day goes, and then you get there, you're like so excited, all of a sudden, stream of snot coming out the nose, absolutely knackered, like you don't know where you've been because nobody else around you has the flu, and you're lying on the beach with, you know, tissue up your nose. So it's like, and I totally think that's true. It's almost like your body's just like, okay, finally I can relax.
And the adrenaline drops and all the chemical changes within the body. And really what we ought to be doing is building into our daily lives that point at which we are not at that point of overwhelm. But what is society like in this, particularly in the UK? You know, we're really driven. I mean, and even again, back to my soapbox with the children, you know, if you have a day off sick, then you're going to, you know, it'll affect your GCSE results. It's like, they're 5. Should we, if they need a day at home, should we let them have a day at home? You know,
100%.
And it's then we're back again to that not listening, you know, not being able to listen, not being able to hear what it is that we need, you know.
100%. I mean, I did Montessori teaching for a while, and so I'm really kind of big on following the child's interest, and in the future, if I have children, that would definitely be the way that I would like to set the nursery up, have Montessori, favorable environment, and all of these things, and learning through experience. And it's, I guess, that element of dictatorship that we have installed on us. If you are going to school, even if you're going to nursery, it's like there's rules at nursery which are different from home. And some of these children are starting at nursery from like what, one? So from the age of one, they're instilled that you need to, have these certain things that you do. And yeah, I 100% could speak about it all day as well, because I feel like that's obviously, Montessori was a big believer, and anyone listening who's not familiar with Montessori, she was like the first Italian woman doctor back in the day. And she came up with this concept that, you know, if you follow the lead of the child rather than dictating and instilling your values onto them, that they just become a mini you, and they're not actually becoming a version of themselves, a grown version of themselves, then beautiful things can happen. And that's where we get pioneers. That's where we get new ideas, because people have been given the space to explore and become creative. So yeah, I could stand on a soapbox with you.
Yeah, and well, I mean, I much as it does contribute somewhat to the beginning of my fatigue. My son, when he was 12, he ended up coming out of school, and I homeschooled him.
Good for you.
And whilst that was overwhelming, it was entirely the right thing to do. And it was the trigger rather than the cause, if that makes sense, for the beginning of my sort of fatigue and things. But it was yeah, it's huge, and it's meant that he's developed into a very, very sort of well-rounded human being. And as I say, we could talk about this all day, but I think we maybe we'll have to do another one. Yeah.
I love it. So one thing I wanted to kind of go back to, actually, I wrote a little note here, is, obviously, you mentioned you were adopted, you had a fantastic family, everything was well in that respect. But obviously that's a huge thing as a small child or baby to go through.
Mhm.
And I've always wondered about, I guess, the mother who is, growing a child in her womb. If she's stressed, if she's having trauma whilst birthing that child or
Mhm.
growing that child, are there scientific studies to show that it affects the child after they come out? Like how is that? Because I'm always so like cautious about the environment where I eventually want to be pregnant in.
Mm. I think so. I would say there's not enough evidence, interestingly
Mhm.
enough. I think both for the sort of the in utero period and for the birthing experience, if that makes sense. But there's more and more coming,
Mhm.
which indicates that, yeah, I mean, essentially you're growing in a sort of primordial soup, and if that has stress hormones in it, then essentially that's going to affect the way that things uh, are demonstrated and what happens later. There's a very interesting podcast between Dr. Rangan Chatterjee and Dr. Bruce Lipton talking about expression of genetics depending on the sort of the medium in which we're grown in, and saying that even adopted children will experience the same sort of illnesses and diseases that their adoptive family will, because of the stressful environment that they're in. And again, Dr. Gabor Mate talks about this. Actually, it's that environment that of family. So if our parents are stressed and the children are stressed, and then actually that has an effect, as I say, ongoing into our adult lives. So I'd say the evidence is around. There's not a huge amount of it, but I think it's about. I suppose what I would really wish is that I would really wish that our society was slightly different, and that people were allowed to be themselves and allowed to express themselves with regards to pain, and that was sort of authenticity of being you. And I think that was, as I say, in my recovery journey, that was when I learned interesting enough that I was enough, and that I didn't have to be good enough, and I didn't have to strive the whole time to be something I wasn't. I wouldn't say I've got that licked 100%. I think I'm still, that my people pleasers in there. I wrote a blog that said why I had to give up perfectionism to recover from fibromyalgia, because it is that push, that internal push, that is so important. But I really think it's important for people to have hope. I think for people in pain, particularly, there's so little hope often when you get the diagnosis, whether that's fibromyalgia or you end up without a diagnosis, very much like, oh, well, we can't find anything wrong on your tests, so go away, sort of thing. You've got to live with it. And there's an element of that within the health service are offering group sessions for chronic pain management, and that it's good in one way, but actually if you just teach people to manage it, then actually they don't have any hope of recovery. So then there's still not that sense of being able to change that nervous system. There's that sort of sense of doom within the nervous system. So that's one thing that I think is really important about this work, is actually if you've got chronic pain and you don't have anything else going on that has indicated a problem, if that makes sense, on a blood test or a scan, then actually there is hope for recovery. Now, the trouble we have a little bit is that actually you can have a scan like I did, and it can tell you that you've got degenerative disc disease. And so therefore, if that's the last piece of information you receive, that's the bit you believe. And it's given to you by, a person in a white coat. And therefore the doctor said that I've got this. And actually, sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not. But in a population of 46-year-olds with no pain, if you scan them, 71% of them will have bulging discs, but they haven't got any pain. So the trouble is if you've got pain and you go and have a scan, there's a good chance you're going to find something. So then you pin it on that, and it's pinned on that physicality, and then the belief is that that's what I'm stuck with, and therefore I'm not going to get better, and nobody's offering me anything. And so that's that raising awareness of, hang on a minute, have you got pain that moves? Have you got pain that varies? Have you had a previous sort of stressful incident at the time that the pain came on? Does your pain go away when you have a nice day? Are there other added factors, sleep issues, anxiety, irritable bowel, irritable bladder, skin issues? If we start to build that picture, then usually there's a way that we can help. And it's about, I think it's probably, if you took sort of non-specific low back pain, it's somewhere between 80 and 90% could be helped by this mind-body approach, and yet we're probably, I don't know how many we're getting to, but it's a minuscule amount of those.
Wow.
So.
Wow. Well, honestly, I'm so glad that you've been on here today, because it's mind blowing, and I really hope that anyone listening, has been introduced to the wonderful work that you do, and also SIRPA training in specifically. And something that came to mind that I wanted to ask is, I know you said a big part of it is about belief, and have you ever got a patient come through your doors who's very much set on what they believe? I know what I believe. I've done my research. This is what I've got. I'm tarnished with it for the rest of my life. Nothing you can do to help. So what do you do when you get that sort of person come in who is so set on their beliefs, that this mind-body connection is all, woo-woo? How do you deal with that? Have you, do they heal still, or is it you can't help them?
That's a really good question, and again, it's quite individual, and I think that's the beauty of being able to treat everybody as an individual. I had a lovely lady I used to treat, and she had a terrible of instant pain coming on after a traumatic incident, and but she was very in the biomedical model. It was very much this and that, and she'd had a variety of symptoms. And I think it took 4 years of me seeing her with my osteopath hat on, treating her physically, relaxing her, her body, and all that sort of, having an influence on calming her nervous system that would make her feel better. I think it was 4 years before she then came back and says, I think this might be stress related. Like, do you know, I think you might be right. And then so some people get really cross with you. Actually, they don't want to hear, and that's fine. And we're lucky as physical therapists, with the added part of the SIRPA, that we can then treat the body physically, release tension. And very often with this, there's a sense of dialed up tension. It's like all the muscles are tighter than they should be. It's like they're running, but they're not moving, if that makes sense. So there's a sense of that. So we can work on sort of from the physical to the neurological side of things. But if you can get it from the neurological side of it and the from the inside out as well, then you're going to be much more effective. It's so it truly varies. So I think if somebody's really, I preach a lot. I feel like I preach pain science to a lot of people, and I have to be careful because I'm passionate about helping people. Some people are definitely not ready to hear it. Some people will grasp a concept of it, and then some people will get it, and it's like, as I say, it's like the world opens up, and it's like, oh my God. We had a lady in a little while ago, and I think she'd been told 25 years before that she'd got severe back pain. She'd ended up in hospital, and they'd said it could have been cauda equina syndrome. Now, cauda equina syndrome is a compression of the nerves to the legs, low back and pelvis, and it is serious, in that moment, and it can affect the bowel and the bladder habit permanently if you don't get it fixed. And anyway, she'd gone into things. She didn't have that. She probably had a muscle spasm in her back. I don't know because I didn't see her then. But 25 years later, she was still in pain in her back. And she came to see me. And she said, well, and I said, one of the questions we always ask is, what do you worry that it is? Well, I worry this is the cauda equina syndrome. And she took this card out of her purse that she'd been given in the hospital 25 years ago, so that she could check the symptoms if she needed to go back. And I said, with looking at you, I said, you don't have that. I said, I've been in practice for 20 something years, nearly 30 years. I said, I've never seen one. So I think probably it isn't that. I think probably the shock of that and the worry and the anxiety surrounding that has kept you in this space. And I think we treated her very gently physically. We gave her that information. She only came back once because she'd got no pain. So 25 years of holding on to something, and her nervous system being excruciating, thinking every time she breathed, every time she moved, every time she sat down, stood up, did anything, she was going to get this cauda equina syndrome. Wow. And so it's but it really varies. It really varies. So
I think that so would you always suggest, say, if somebody's listening, they are in pain, they've been and seen a couple of doctors, and they've been maybe diagnosed with something, would you always suggest getting third, fourth, fifth opinions, just to kind of look at other options?
Yeah, I think we always have to be really careful too, because essentially, whilst 85% of people are going to fall into this mind-body bracket in some way, shape or form, there are going to be the odd ones that are not there. But very often by the time they get to us, they've had all those tests and they've had everything else ruled out, or they've had, unfortunately, as I say, ruled in stuff that isn't actually important. And there's a lot of conditions that are named just because. Fibromyalgia is an absolutely key example. What does fibromyalgia mean? It means kind of fibrous muscles. What is that? Fibrous muscles. Well, why? It doesn't answer the why. But we always say to people, if you are concerned about something, particularly if you are feeling extremely unwell, which of course, unfortunately, these conditions can make you feel unwell. But if you've got night sweats, or you're losing masses of weight or putting masses of weight on, that sort of thing, that can be something that we need to consider. But if you've had a lot of tests and you've not got any results for those, that's kind of nothing conclusive, then very often that would be a good time to look out for a SIRPA practitioner to have just a consultation. Many of my colleagues and I do a free, people do free discovery calls, so that actually they can discuss that with you and have a sort of chat and see whether you fall into that category. Not all SIRPA practitioners are physical therapists. They might be psychotherapists as well. So there's you don't have to have the hands-on. We actually combine it in practice that works really well, so we can scoop up everybody across the board. But yeah, I mean, I think you can explore it at the same time as your medical diagnosis too. But I think it's suddenly when your eyes are open to oh, hang on a minute, this might be related to something else, then you've suddenly got a whole nother world to look at.
And for anyone out there who wants to find a SIRPA therapist, or and this is international as well, we have lots of different listeners from all over the world. How do they find? Is there a directory they can look at?
Yeah, no, so SIRPA have a website, which is www.sirpa.org. And essentially they have practitioners mostly in the UK, some in the US, I think some in Spain, maybe Australia. So they have a directory of practitioners. They also on their website have a fantastic number of success stories. There's a huge number of success stories from people with all sorts of different kind of persistent pain and chronic fatigue situations. So that's a really nice place to go and have a look anyway. If you're in the States, particularly, there's an organization called the Psychophysiologic Disorder Association, the PPDA, and they are almost like a sister organization to SIRPA, but in the States, and they're training, again, practitioners and doctors out there in this mind-body approach. For online resources, there's, you know, the Curable app is one that particularly springs to mind, that actually is a program online that takes you through all this information, all of it being based on the same mind-body approach that was brought to the world by Dr. Sarno in the 80s, I think. And I mean, we ourselves actually have a Change Your Pain toolkit. So again, it's another online resource as well. But SIRPA, the SIRPA website is a really great place to either find a practitioner, but also find out more about it, and also find their success stories.
Amazing. And so we're rounding up to the end of the conversation now, and I just wanted to close with any sort of last words you had for the audience in terms of anyone out there who's listening and they've been experiencing chronic pain for a really long time, and this might be a light bulb moment for them. This could be transformative in moving forward in their life. So yeah, any words of encouragement or hope that you have for those people listening?
Well, definitely. I mean, I think one of the reasons I love talking about it is that I've lived the journey, so I really understand, and I understand that, you know, really difficult place where it's like nobody's hearing you. There seems to be no hope. And I think what I hope that this will do is bring that awareness. And as I say, if people want to get in touch with me or with SIRPA, then that's really great to have that. And I also think so in 2017, I couldn't walk my dogs around the block because my back was so painful. I had to pay somebody to walk my dogs. I was just managing to hold my job down. I was, as I say, home educating. I was a single parent, single income household. You know, it was like I wasn't sure I was ever going to get off the sofa again. And last year, I climbed Ben Nevis, Scafell Pike, and Snowdon, the 3 highest peaks in the UK. Not in 24 hours, needless to say, over a week. But I never thought I'd get there. And I think that is what this approach has done for me. It's like I've got my life back. And therefore, whatever your beliefs, even if you've got an inkling that you might be able to have an interest with this, because the beauty of this is nobody is going to diss you. Nobody in this world is going to say, I don't believe you. They're going to say, we get it. We understand it. We know what's going on. We can give you individualized tools to help you, to help yourself to sort this out.
Fantastic. Wow. I mean, so glad that you've been on the show today, Pippa. It's been fantastic hearing more about your journey, and you're so knowledgeable and passionate, which I think comes across so well. So thank you from myself and the Moody Girl audience. I'm sure we will help a lot of people with this conversation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a lovely day. Is it sunny where you are?
A little cloudy at the moment, but it's kind of quite good for chores. So
yeah, perfect. Well, lovely to chat with you. Thank you so much for your time, and take care.
You too.
Bye.